chains, and submission. These were the defining realities for countless women whose names history never bothered to record. In the sprawling urban centers of Rome, beneath the marble facades and triumphant arches that proclaimed imperial glory, a darker truth festered like an untreated wound. Female slaves, stripped of identity, dignity, and hope, endured horrors that would make modern observers recoil in revulsion. Their suffering was not merely incidental to Roman civilization, but fundamental to its very structure. The morning markets of ancient Rome echoed with the cries of auctioneers hawking human flesh alongside pottery and grain. But for the women dragged onto those wooden platforms, naked and trembling, this was not commerce, but the beginning of a nightmare that would consume their entire existence. The buyers who examined their teeth, felt their muscles, and appraised their bodies like livestock were purchasing more than labor. They were acquiring complete dominion over another human soul. To understand the full scope of female slavery's brutality in Rome, we must first grasp the society that created and sustained it. The Roman Empire at its height stretched from Britain to the deserts of North Africa, encompassing millions of souls. Conservative estimates suggest that 1 in 3 inhabitants of Italy were enslaved, with women comprising roughly half of that staggering number. These were not abstract statistics, but individual human beings, each with dreams, fears, and capacity for suffering that matched any citizen. The sources of female slaves revealed the empire's voracious appetite for human bondage. Military campaigns across 3 continents fed a constant stream of captives into Roman markets. When legions conquered Germanic tribes, Celtic settlements, or African kingdoms, women and children were systematically separated from their communities and herded like cattle towards slave markets. Birth provided another steady supply, as children born to enslaved mothers automatically inherited their bondage. Roman law viewed these newborns not as human beings with inherent rights, but as property to be registered alongside livestock and household goods. Debt slavery ensnared countless free women who found themselves unable to meet financial obligations. A widow struggling to pay her deceased husband's debts might discover herself and her daughters legally transformed into property overnight. Kidnapping and piracy supplied additional victims, with organized criminal networks operating throughout the Mediterranean to capture and sell human beings. The scale of this trade was industrial, with specialized markets in major cities handling thousands of slaves monthly. The moment of sale represented a woman's complete transformation from person to property. Slave markets operated with horrifying efficiency, designed to maximize profits while stripping victims of every vestige of humanity. Women were typically displayed nude, their bodies marked with chalk to indicate defects or special qualities. Potential buyers examined them with the same detached scrutiny they might apply to purchasing a horse, checking for signs of disease, pregnancy, or previous damage. The language of these transactions reveals their dehumanizing nature. Legal documents describe women as merchandise, listing physical attributes alongside market prices. A young woman from Gaul might be catalogued as having good teeth, clear skin, and potential for breeding, her value calculated based on her reproductive capacity and anticipated years of service. Older women commanded lower prices, their worth diminished by perceived limitations in productivity and durability. Once purchased, a female slave's fate depended entirely on her owner's whims and circumstances. Wealthy households might require dozens of enslaved women to maintain their elaborate lifestyles. These domestic slaves faced a hierarchy of suffering based on their assigned roles. Kitchen workers endured scalding heat, dangerous knives, and constant supervision while preparing elaborate feasts for their masters. Their days began before dawn and ended long after the household retired, with every meal representing another opportunity for punishment if dishes failed to meet expectations. Textile workers spent endless hours hunched over looms, their fingers bleeding from repeated contact with rough fibers. The finest Roman clothing depended on their skill, yet they themselves wore coarse tunics that barely protected them from cold and weather. Their eyes frequently suffered permanent damage from the strain of detailed work in poor lighting, leaving many partially blind by middle age. Personal attendants faced perhaps the most psychologically devastating bondage. Required to anticipate their mistress's every need, they lived in constant fear of triggering violent outbursts over imagined slights. Roman matrons, themselves often powerless in their marriages, frequently vented their frustrations on these vulnerable women. A slave girl might face brutal beatings for arranging her mistress's hair incorrectly or failing to prevent wrinkles in clothing. The sexual exploitation of female slaves represented one of Roman society's most systematic horrors. Legal codes explicitly granted masters unlimited access to their slaves' bodies, viewing rape not as a crime, but as property use. Young girls, some barely past childhood, found themselves subjected to sexual violence as routine as daily meals. The psychological trauma of this abuse compounded with complete lack of legal recourse, creating wounds that never healed. Pregnancy offered no protection from exploitation. Pregnant slaves continued working until the moment of birth, often delivering their children while maintaining their assigned duties. From these unions belonged entirely the infants born to their mothers' owners, who might sell them immediately or raise them as future slaves. Mothers watched helplessly as their children were torn away, knowing they might never see them again. Rural estates presented different but equally horrific conditions for enslaved women. Agricultural work demanded backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset, with women expected to match male productivity despite receiving smaller food rations. During harvest seasons, they worked 18-hour days under scorching sun or driving rain, their hands raw from handling sharp tools and thorny plants. Female agricultural slaves often lived in conditions that would shame modern farmers housing livestock. Cramped barracks provided minimal shelter, with dozens of women sharing spaces barely large enough for half their number. Sanitation was non-existent, leading to rampant disease that owners viewed as acceptable losses. Those who fell ill faced abandonment or execution, as nursing sick slaves was considered economically inefficient. Mining operations employed enslaved women in some of the empire's most dangerous work. Silver mines in Spain, gold deposits in Dacia, and quarries throughout the provinces consumed female lives with industrial efficiency. These women descended into tunnels that frequently collapsed, breathed air thick with deadly particles, and handled toxic materials that slowly poisoned their bodies. Life expectancy in such conditions rarely exceeded a few years. The legal framework surrounding female slavery reveals Roman society's complete dehumanization of these women. Slaves possessed no rights whatsoever under Roman law. They could not own property, enter contracts, or seek legal redress for any treatment, no matter how brutal. Masters held power of life and death over their slaves, with killing an enslaved person carrying no greater legal consequence than destroying any other piece of property. Torture was not only legal but encouraged as a method of extracting testimony from slaves in legal proceedings. Roman courts assumed that slaves would naturally lie to protect themselves or their masters, making torture necessary to obtain truth. These judicial tortures employed techniques designed to maximize pain while keeping victims alive long enough to provide testimony. Female slaves faced additional sexual tortures that combined legal procedure with sadistic gratification. The psychological impact of this systematic dehumanization was devastating and intentional. Roman slaveholders understood that breaking spirits was as important as controlling bodies. Slaves who maintained hope or dignity posed greater escape risks and required more supervision. Systematic humiliation, arbitrary punishment, and constant reminders of powerlessness served to create the docile workforce that Roman prosperity demanded. Religious practices offered no solace for enslaved women. While some cults welcomed slaves, participation required their master's permission, which was rarely granted. Traditional Roman religion emphasized social hierarchy and divine approval of existing power structures, providing no comfort to those trapped at society's bottom. The few spiritual traditions that promised eventual liberation were ruthlessly suppressed by authorities who understood their subversive potential. The economic calculations underlying female slavery reveal its central importance to Roman prosperity. Wealthy households depended entirely on enslaved labor to maintain their elaborate lifestyles. The textiles that clothed Roman citizens, the food that graced their tables, and the services that sustained their comfort all depended on the unpaid labor of enslaved women. The calculations were coldly precise. A female slave who cost 30 denarii could generate that value in textile production within months, then continue producing profit for decades. This economic model incentivized masters to extract maximum labor while providing minimal sustenance, creating a system where human beings were literally worked to death for profit. Account books from Pompeii reveal household budgets that allocated more money for horse feed than for feeding enslaved women, reflecting their perceived value in the economic hierarchy. The breeding of slaves represented perhaps the most callous aspect of this economic exploitation. Masters treated fertile women as livestock, deliberately selecting breeding partners to produce children with desirable traits. Strong men were paired with healthy women to create robust workers, while intelligent slaves might be bred with the hope of producing skilled artisans or educated servants. The children resulting from these forced unions were property from birth, their entire lives predetermined by their mother's bondage. These breeding programs extended beyond simple reproduction. Masters kept detailed records of their female slaves' menstrual cycles, monitoring fertility with the same attention they devoted to their cattle. Women who failed to conceive faced punishment for their perceived economic failure, while those who bore children too frequently might be separated from their infants to prevent maternal bonds that could interfere with productivity. The medical treatment of enslaved women reflected their status as valuable property rather than human beings deserving care. Roman medical texts discuss slave health in purely economic terms, recommending treatments only when the cost of medicine was less than replacing the slave. A woman suffering from a broken bone might receive treatment if she was young and valuable, but an older slave with the same injury would likely be left to heal improperly or abandoned entirely. Pregnancy presented complex calculations for masters. A pregnant slave represented both potential profit through her offspring and temporary loss of productivity. Medical papyri reveal that enslaved women received minimal prenatal care, with masters viewing pregnancy complications as acceptable business risks. Maternal mortality rates among slaves far exceeded those of free women, partly due to poor nutrition and continued heavy labor throughout pregnancy. The sexual exploitation of female slaves extended far beyond individual masters. Roman law permitted masters to rent out their slaves for sexual services, creating a lucrative trade in human bodies. Brothels throughout the empire relied heavily on enslaved women who had no choice in their participation. These establishments operated with legal sanction, their profits contributing to municipal tax revenues and private fortunes built on systematic rape. The psychological techniques used to maintain control over enslaved women were sophisticated and brutal. Masters understood that physical restraints alone could not ensure complete submission. They employed systematic humiliation, arbitrary rewards and punishments, and careful manipulation of hope and despair to break their slaves' will to resist. A woman might receive an unexpected kindness one day, followed by savage punishment the next, creating a psychological dependency that made escape seem impossible even when physically feasible. Language itself became a weapon of oppression. Enslaved women were forbidden from using their native tongues, forced to communicate only in Latin or Greek as determined by their masters. This linguistic suppression severed connections to their cultural identities and made communication among slaves from different regions more difficult. Names were similarly stripped away, with slaves receiving new designations that reflected their owners' preferences rather than their original identities. The clothing and appearance of female slaves served as constant reminders of their status. They were required to wear specific garments that immediately identified their condition to any observer. Hairstyles, jewelry, and even posture were regulated to maintain visible distinctions between free and enslaved women. These appearance requirements extended to branding and tattooing, with many slaves bearing permanent marks that identified their owners and prevented escape attempts. The daily routines imposed on enslaved women were designed to maximize productivity while minimizing opportunities for rest or reflection. Work began before dawn and continued until long after sunset, with brief breaks only for essential needs. This relentless schedule served multiple purposes beyond mere economic efficiency. Exhausted slaves had less energy for resistance or escape planning, while constant supervision during work hours prevented the formation of conspiracies or emotional bonds that might threaten the system. Punishment for enslaved women took forms specifically designed to terrorize other slaves while satisfying their masters' sadistic impulses. Public beatings served as entertainment and education, demonstrating the consequences of disobedience to audiences of trembling witnesses. The implements used for these punishments were carefully chosen to maximize pain while avoiding damage that would reduce the slave's economic value. Crucifixion, though typically reserved for male slaves, was occasionally applied to women as an extreme form of public execution. These spectacles drew crowds of citizens who viewed the prolonged suffering as both justice and entertainment. The dying woman's agony could last for days, her body displayed as a warning to other slaves while providing sadistic gratification to observers. The isolation imposed on female slaves prevented the formation of support networks that might have provided emotional comfort or practical assistance. Masters deliberately separated women from their families, cultures, and languages, creating atomized individuals who had no one to trust or rely upon. This isolation was maintained through constant surveillance, informant networks among slaves, and severe punishment for any display of mutual aid or solidarity. Transportation of slaves throughout the empire created additional layers of suffering for women who had already endured capture and sale. Chained together in cramped ships or wagons, they faced weeks or months of travel in conditions that killed significant numbers before reaching their destinations. Ship manifests list female slaves alongside cargo, their deaths recorded as business losses rather than human tragedies. The specialized markets for different types of enslaved women reveal the systematic nature of their exploitation. Young girls were prized for domestic service and sexual availability, commanding high prices from wealthy households. Older women with specific skills might find themselves in workshops or medical facilities, their expertise extracted without compensation or recognition. Those deemed suitable only for heavy labor faced the shortest and most brutal lives in mines, fields, or construction projects. The resistance attempts by enslaved women, though rarely successful, demonstrate the enduring human spirit even under the most oppressive conditions. Some tried to poison their masters, accepting certain death as preferable to continued bondage. Others attempted escape, though the penalties for recapture included mutilation, torture, and execution. These acts of defiance were systematically suppressed and their perpetrators made examples of, yet they continued nonetheless. The few paths to freedom available to enslaved women were themselves forms of exploitation. Manumission often came with conditions that maintained economic dependence on former masters, while the promise of eventual freedom was used to extract decades of compliant service. Women who achieved legal freedom frequently found themselves bound by debt or family obligations that perpetuated their practical enslavement under different names. The documentation of these horrors emerges from sources that viewed such suffering as mundane business matters rather than human tragedies. Papyrus records from Egyptian estates catalogue the deaths of female slaves with the same detached precision used for recording broken pottery or spoiled grain. When a woman died from exhaustion in the fields, scribes noted the loss of productive capacity and the need for replacement, nothing more. These administrative documents reveal the systematic nature of the exploitation, showing how entire bureaucracies existed to manage the buying, selling, and disposal of human beings. Medical treatises of the period discuss female slaves as experimental subjects for testing treatments too dangerous for free patients. Physicians practicing on enslaved women faced no consequences for failed procedures or permanent damage caused by their interventions. These medical experiments, conducted without consent or anesthesia, often left survivors mutilated or disabled. The knowledge gained from such practices benefited free citizens, while the subjects who made it possible suffered in anonymity. The architectural remains of Roman villas and estates provide silent testimony to the living conditions endured by enslaved women. Archaeological excavations reveal cramped quarters built beneath grand dining halls, windowless cells where dozens of women shared spaces barely adequate for a few. The contrast between the luxurious living areas of masters and the squalid accommodations of their slaves demonstrates the calculated dehumanization built into Roman domestic architecture. Graffiti scratched into walls by enslaved women offers rare glimpses into their inner lives and desperate hopes. These crude inscriptions, hidden in forgotten corners of ancient buildings, speak of longing for lost families, prayers to gods who seem deaf to their pleas, and occasional expressions of defiant anger. One such message, discovered in a Roman villa in Britain, simply reads, "Livia remembers Gaul," a poignant reminder that beneath the imposed Latin names and forced cultural assimilation, original identities persisted in secret. The religious festivals of Rome provided no respite from suffering for enslaved women. While free citizens celebrated with feasting and entertainment, slaves worked harder than ever to prepare elaborate celebrations they could never join. The Saturnalia, supposedly a time when social roles reversed temporarily, offered only cruel mockery to enslaved women who might serve their masters at table while still facing punishment for the slightest error. The legal precedents established by Roman courts regarding female slaves created frameworks for oppression that would echo through centuries. Judges ruled consistently that any injury to a slave constituted damage to property rather than assault on a person. These decisions established legal principles that valued enslaved women purely as economic assets, with their pain and suffering legally irrelevant unless it affected their productive capacity. The training methods used to break the spirits of newly enslaved women were refined through generations of practice. Experienced slave masters understood that the first weeks of bondage were crucial for establishing permanent submission. They employed calculated mixtures of violence and false kindness, creating psychological dependency that made resistance seem futile even when opportunities arose. A woman might receive unexpected food or temporary reprieve from labor, only to face savage punishment hours later, destroying her ability to predict or control her circumstances. The breeding records maintained by Roman estate managers reveal the industrial scale of human reproduction under slavery. Detailed logs tracked which women conceived when they gave birth and which children survived to working age. These documents discuss human beings in terms identical to livestock breeding, with notes about desirable genetic combinations and the economic value of different bloodlines. Women who failed to produce viable offspring faced punishment or sale to less desirable positions. The urban workshops of Rome depended heavily on skilled female slaves who produced the luxury goods that defined imperial wealth. Textile workshops employed hundreds of women working in conditions that would horrify modern observers. They labored in poorly ventilated rooms filled with toxic dyes and dangerous machinery, their health sacrificed for the production of fine fabrics worn by citizens who never considered the human cost of their comfort. The glass-making facilities scattered throughout the empire relied on enslaved women to perform the most dangerous tasks in production. Working with molten materials in extreme heat, these women faced constant risk of severe burns and respiratory damage from toxic fumes. The beautiful vessels and decorative objects they created adorned wealthy homes while their creators lived in squalor and died young from occupational hazards. The systematic separation of mothers from children represented one of slavery's most psychologically devastating aspects. Roman law treated these separations as property transfers, with no consideration for maternal bonds or child welfare. Women watched helplessly as their infants were sold to distant owners, knowing they would likely never see them again. This deliberate destruction of family bonds served to prevent the formation of kinship networks that might threaten the system. The educational exploitation of intelligent enslaved women reveals another dimension of their systematic oppression. Those who demonstrated literacy or mathematical skills found themselves forced to teach the children of their masters while being forbidden from educating their own offspring. These women possessed knowledge and abilities that would have commanded respect in free society, yet they remained property whose intellectual gifts were extracted without recognition or compensation. The religious ceremonies conducted by enslaved women in secret reveal their desperate search for meaning and hope within hopeless circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests hidden shrines in slave quarters, where women gathered to practice forbidden rituals from their homelands. Discovery of these religious activities resulted in savage punishment, yet they persisted, demonstrating the human need for spiritual connection even under the most oppressive conditions. The maritime trade in female slaves involved specialized ships designed specifically for transporting human cargo. These vessels featured compartments barely large enough for their occupants, with minimal ventilation and sanitation. Mortality rates during transport reached horrific levels, with ship captains calculating acceptable losses into their profit margins. Women who survived these journeys arrived at their destinations physically and psychologically shattered. The marble columns and golden statues of Rome could not mask the fundamental truth that its grandeur was built upon an ocean of human suffering. These nameless women, whose screams echoed through villa corridors and workshop floors, were not footnotes to Roman history, but its very foundation. Their stolen lives, broken bodies, and shattered spirits remind us that civilization's greatest monuments often cast the darkest shadows. In remembering their pain, we honor the countless souls whose names were erased but whose humanity endured.